purpose of this presentation is to provide an overview of the fiscal year 2025 Emergency Supplemental Historic Preservation Fund grant program. This presentation will provide a program overview and discuss the application process, specifically for state and tribal historic preservation offices that are eligible and interested in applying. A separate presentation will be provided for the preservation notice of funding opportunity for all eligible entities. So first, to provide some background on this new program, it was appropriated in December 2024 under the American Relief Act, the continuing resolution that was provided at that time. It provides an additional amount for the Historic Preservation Fund for necessary expenses related to the consequences of natural disasters. More specifically, we will be awarding $48 million to be competitively awarded under two separate notices of funding opportunity, or NOFOs. This is a bit different from our previous emergency supplemental HPF grants, but we will be awarding under one notice of funding opportunity specifically for capacity and survey grants to state and tribal historic preservation offices. And then we have the second notice of funding opportunity for physical preservation grants that may be awarded not just to the SHPOs and THPOs, but to other state, tribal, and territorial government agencies, local governments, including certified local governments, and nonprofits, which can include educational institutions. As written in the appropriation, no match is required. The projects run under this program will also be in-house and contract projects, so significantly different from our previous disaster programs. We will not be running subgrants under this new funding. You can still apply for multiple projects under one application. You are also welcome to apply for resources on behalf of other property owners with owner consent, but the projects will ultimately be managed in-house or as contract projects. In terms of eligibility, these grants are eligible to areas that have received a FEMA Major Disaster Declaration pursuant to the Stafford Act in calendar years 2023 and/or 2024. As far as determining eligibility, we have created a web map tool to help you search your location or the location of specific resources layered with those eligible areas. You can also overlay tribal areas as well as certified local governments to search that way. You can filter by year, so you can search via 2023 and/or 2023 disasters. You can search and filter by the declaration number, which you can also find that declaration number via FEMA's website, and/or you can search by the specific named disaster. Now, not every eligible disaster has a specific name, so you may still need to search by location or declaration number, but for some storms like Hurricane Helene, you can filter for those specifically. So I'm going to provide an overview of each of the notice of funding opportunities. Then I'll go over the application process and some of the requirements as they apply to both applications. And then we'll talk through a few FAQs to wrap up. But the capacity grants, so those are listed in grants.gov under opportunity number 257, and they'll be listed as the ESHPF capacity grants. In terms of eligibility, it is solely open to state and tribal historic preservation offices, and those offices should have areas with major disaster declarations within their jurisdictions for 23 and 24. So for a SHPO, that could be counties in their state. For a THPO, that would be tribal lands that the THPO manages, where they either have a disaster declaration or that is overlaid with areas that have received a major disaster declaration. Grant amounts may range from $75,000 to $15 million, and matching funds, as I said, are not required. That range is intentionally very broad, so you could come in on the lower end for one specific activity, like hiring a staff person or for a specific contract project, or you can apply on the higher end of the range for multiple projects under one application. The purpose of the funding is for capacity needed by SHPOs and THPOs to complete compliance activities and for other in-house or contract projects like survey or planning to support areas with major disaster declarations. The deadline for this program is June 12th, so the program applications are open for 30 days. Our goal with that short timeline is to get that money out to you guys as quickly as we can. In terms of eligible activities under the capacity grants, again, that could include administration, National Register nominations, planning, survey and inventory and identifying sites, as well as review and compliance activities. So just to provide a few examples of some projects you might think about applying for, you could use the funds under the capacity grant to hire staff or for personnel costs to fund, say, internal Section 106 staffing if you're dealing with an influx of reviews. The one word of caution I would add if you are looking at hiring staff with these funds is just to make sure that you're keeping track of how you're charging those costs to ensure that you're charging it to the appropriate grant or funding source. So if that staff person is also paid through your HPF annual grant, just making sure that you're keeping track of how those projects or that percentage of time is being charged appropriately to keep your accounting lined up. You could also use the funds to hire, say, a consultant to conduct surveys. We have had projects under our previous programs where SHPOs focused on conducting surveys of rural resources that hadn't really been surveyed in a long time in eligible counties. We've had other SHPOs that have focused on conducting surveys in all of the urban centers across their state. So there's a lot of different variations that you could think about there. You could also use it for technology updates. Do you have, an electronic 106 system that needs updates, or improvements for efficiency to handle that influx of Section 106 reviews as a result of the disaster? You could use it for disaster mitigation planning. Unlike our previous disaster programs, we're not requiring that you update your state plan with some of that disaster preparedness language, but that would still be an eligible cost if that is something that you were looking to do. You could also work internally or hire a consultant to do a separate plan. The project in the top right corner here that I've highlighted was a project that the Texas SHPO did with the University of Texas at San Antonio. They developed a toolkit for historic houses of worship, so a planning document like that would be an option. You could also do survey and nomination work for eligible resources in affected counties. That was a lot of the work that the Louisiana SHPO did here with their previous disaster grant. They really focused on collecting a lot of survey and GIS data and using that to determine eligibility and get started on nominations in those affected counties. You could also use it for training if that is something of interest or that you think that your communities may need. Under our previous program, we had worked with the National Alliance of Preservation Commissions to develop a resilience and disaster training focused curriculum for their commission assistance and mentoring program. So you could pay to host something like that in all of the eligible counties and do trainings across the counties. So there's a lot of different options. If you're not sure where to start, or not sure if what you're thinking about may be eligible, please feel free to send us an email or give us a call, and we're happy to talk through project ideas. In terms of the evaluation criteria for the capacity grants, I won't walk through everything here, and all of this information is also written in detail in the Notice of Funding Opportunities. I did want to include all of the information on these slides so that you can use it as a resource and pause it and reference it as you're working on your applications, but please know that the information is also available within the application itself. The one point that I wanted to highlight in the evaluation criteria under feasibility, it discusses listing and describing all tasks and their anticipated results. Again, I just want to emphasize that you don't need to apply or submit separate applications for each project or activity. You would submit one application under the capacity NOFO for all of the projects and activities that you are intending to do, and you would list those out in the application. So if you are intending to hire a staff person and run 3 surveys and write 2 nominations, you would submit 1 application, but you would list out all of those activities. In terms of what is not funded under the capacity grant, again, I won't go through everything on this list here, providing it primarily for reference, but the 2 things that I will highlight are, again, physical preservation will not be funded under the capacity notice of funding opportunity. You would apply for that work under the preservation notice of funding opportunity that we'll jump to next. The other item that I just want to raise is that we cannot pay for work that was already completed or funded through other federal programs or that have already been reimbursed by FEMA or insurance. That doesn't mean that both funding sources couldn't be involved, but the scope of work does need to be distinct, and that should be clarified in the application if that is the case. So jumping to our preservation grants, those are listed under funding opportunity number 489, and you'll see it listed as ESHPF preservation. As I mentioned earlier, SHPOs and THPOs are eligible to apply under this preservation notice of funding opportunity as well, but it is also open to state and territorial government agencies more broadly. It is also open to federally recognized tribes, Alaska Native and Native Hawaiian organizations. It is open to local governments, including CLGs, as well as nonprofit organizations, including educational institutions. The grants can range from $75,000 to $15 million, and again, no match is required for these as well. The purpose of the funding is for defined repair and recovery projects, including reconstruction, which we'll talk about briefly in just a bit, for resources with documented damage from major disaster declarations in 2023 and or 2024. One specific difference that I will just point out in terms of the eligibility under capacity versus the preservation grants is that under the capacity grants, it might be an area that is eligible, but you're still potentially working on identifying the damage in those areas. So maybe there's an eligible county that you're intending to survey to assess the damage in those areas. In the case of the preservation grants, the resources that you are intending to work on, you should be able to provide damage documentation and show that they have been damaged by an eligible disaster. The deadline for the preservation NOFO is July 15th, so these are open for 60 days. In terms of eligible activities for preservation grants, the focus of the program is on physical preservation, but administration, National Register, planning, survey and inventory, and review and compliance activities to support that work are all eligible costs. Pre-preservation is eligible, so that could include development of architectural plans and specifications, development of historic structure reports. The one thing I will note is that archaeological and architectural surveys that seek to only identify sites are not eligible. So if you are looking to do survey that is focused on identification as a SHPO or THPO, you should be applying for those projects under the capacity notice of funding opportunity. Projects involving just pre-preservation activities should also not exceed 20% of the estimated construction cost. So you just need to make a logical case for that cost breakdown. In terms of preservation projects, these are physical preservation of historic districts, buildings, sites, structures, objects, and as always, the projects must comply with Section 106, Section 110 for NHLs, and NEPA. The projects will also be required to execute a preservation agreement. I will note that pre-preservation costs, again, such as preparing architectural and engineering plans and specs, should not exceed 20% of the total preservation project cost for each site. So, for example, let's say you apply for a grant award for $5 million total, but you are working on a building that you anticipate is going to cost $750,000. The 20% would apply to the $750,000 budget, not the $5 million as a whole. In terms of reconstruction, so as I mentioned, reconstruction of properties may be eligible. If this is something that you are considering, I do encourage you to reach out to us and discuss those project ideas and get a better sense of what you're thinking about. But if you are interested in applying for reconstruction, it may be eligible if it's determined, one, that another of the Secretary of the Interior's treatment standards are not appropriate. The project must also meet the Secretary of the Interior's standards for reconstruction, and that includes providing in your application sufficient historical documentation in addition to the damage documentation. So you should also be providing documentation that the building was significantly damaged by an eligible declared disaster. Projects must also substantially mitigate the threat and include steps to mitigate future risk. Again, just to kind of get you brainstorming some examples of projects that you might think about doing, it might be rehabilitation or reconstruction of several buildings across a historic downtown or historic district. You might consider hiring a consultant or hiring a staff person internally to work on completing historic structure reports and plans and specs across a group of buildings. Maybe elevation is something that is desperately needed for a state-owned property that's had repeated flood events. So there's a lot of different possibilities, and if you're unsure where to start or unsure about the eligibility of a project, feel free to send us your specific questions. The preservation grants do also have slightly more specific National Register and National Historic Landmark requirements as compared to the capacity grants. So the resources that you are working on must be listed or determined eligible for listing in the National Register, an equivalent tribal register, or designated as an NHL, and they can be listed either individually or as contributing to a historic district. Projects that are not yet listed must prepare a nomination as part of the grant project. They don't need to be listed for any specific history, as with some of our other programs, but a nomination does need to be prepared. And the activities for preparing that nomination are eligible costs to the grant. Given that nomination work can be funded under either the capacity or the preservation NOFO, if you are a SHPO or THPO that needs to do a nomination, you can apply for that work under either notice of funding opportunity. And if you're unsure or have questions about that, feel free to send us those questions. The one note I will make is that an updated nomination may not be required for listed resources where you are doing reconstruction under this program, but the grantee will still work closely with the Park Service to document those changes, as well as working closely with MPS, NR, and NHL staff. But again, if you are thinking about reconstruction, I do strongly encourage you to reach out and talk through those ideas with us. In terms of the evaluation criteria for the preservation grants, again, I won't go through every detail here, and it is outlined in the notice of funding opportunity as well. But a couple of things that I did want to highlight under need, urgency, and threat. You do note that you should be providing documentation of the damage, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in terms of project images in just a bit. Again, you don't need to submit separate applications for multiple buildings as far as feasibility. That would be where you would likely list out all of the projects, the buildings, the activities that you intend to work on under one application. And then under sustainability, we ask you to discuss kind of the community benefit of the project. That can be defined very, very broadly. So that could be, does the work protect the community from future disaster impacts in a particular way? Does the building serve the community in some way, or does it carry an important history for the community? Does repair of the resource, improve the life of the residents in some way, or does the resource itself provide an important, community service? Maybe you're looking at doing public participation as part of the project, such as, trades workshops, in conjunction with the preservation work. So again, it can be very broad, but just wanted to bring your attention to that since that is a little bit different from our previous programs as well. In terms of what is not funded under the preservation grants, again, I won't run through everything on this list, but just to highlight a couple of items. Construction of new buildings is not eligible unless it is tied to specific approved reconstruction projects. Also note that contingencies and reserves are not eligible costs, so when you are working on your budget justification worksheet, please keep in mind that all of the cost items should be tied to specific activities and should not be listed as contingencies. And again, as with capacity, we cannot pay for costs for work that was already completed or funded through other federal programs such as SEMA or for insurance. Again, you might have multiple pots of money, involved in a single project. If that is the case, just please make sure to outline what the different grants are funding, how those project scopes or those costs will be kept separate, just to ensure there is no duplication of effort. Application materials. So most of the materials that you will be submitting will be pretty similar between the capacity and preservation notice of funding opportunities. Some of these documents should be pretty familiar to you with your annual grant applications, and some of the documents might be a little bit new. But as with your annual applications, you'll still be submitting the SF424 series of documents. You'll still submit your standard form for lobbying activities disclosure. You'll also still be including your indirect cost statement. But in addition to those application materials, you'll also be submitting the project abstract summary, a project description worksheet, a budget justification worksheet, project images. You'll also include a letter of owner consent, letters of support if you will be working on any properties that you do not own. So if you have a private property owner where you will be carrying out the work on the property for them, you would be submitting that letter of owner consent. And then you should also be including the National Register eligibility worksheet for preservation projects, as we discussed earlier. In terms of project images, the requirements under the capacity NOFO are a bit more broad. So if there are specific resources that you're working on, providing photos of those affected properties should be included. But if you're working on, say, a lot of survey projects, just providing us examples of the type and degree of damage in the state or tribe's jurisdiction would be helpful. In terms of the preservation NOFO, we are looking for more specific information through the photos. So the photos should document the damage from an eligible disaster. You should also be including photos for all of the properties or resources that you're intending to work on. You should also be including before and after photos, and those before photos should be as recent and contemporaneous with the disaster as possible. If you are having trouble tracking down those before photos, consider unconventional sources. We're open to that. It could be from a news article, a social media post, a Google Earth image. It doesn't just have to be, a photo that the owner took of the property right before the disaster per se. In terms of historic photographs, those should be in addition to the before and after photographs, but we do highly encourage inclusion of historic photographs if you're proposing reconstruction. The photos should also show the current conditions of those resources so we have an understanding of what the starting point for these projects are. But again, if you have questions on those specifics, feel free to send those questions over to us. And finally, award selection. So in addition to the evaluation criteria under each of the NOFOs, we may also use planning numbers derived from US Census and FEMA data to guide the allocation of the funding. As we discussed earlier, the range for the funding is $75,000 to $15 million. Of course, you should be keeping in mind that the total pot of money is $48 million, but we do strongly encourage you to genuinely apply for all of the funding that you need. And applicants can still receive partial awards even if the full amount that is requested cannot be accommodated. One suggestion that I might make here is you might consider explaining in your application what your priority list is. So maybe emphasizing, which surveys or which particular resources might be of the highest need. That can be helpful for us to keep in mind. Okay, now I wanted to jump to some of the program grant requirements that would be required if when you were awarded a ESHPF grant. As with all of our HPF awards, it will require compliance with 2 CFR 200, although keep in mind that per 2 CFR 200, states and tribes should be following their internal procurement policies and procedures as applicable. As with our other grants, funding is provided on a reimbursement basis and will be accessed through ASAP. Keep in mind for preservation grants that you will likely need to do a project sign for each of the resources that are being repaired. As always, the work should meet the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines for archaeology and preservation, and the projects will require compliance with Section 106 and the National Environmental Policy. I mentioned easements earlier, but do keep in mind that easements will be required for each site that you're working on under the preservation notice of funding opportunity primarily. But one point that I did want to raise is that the easement duration will be based on the project cost of each site. So similar to our discussion of the pre-preservation costs earlier, if your grant award as a whole is $5 million, but the project or construction at one site costs $750,000, the easement for that property would be 20 years and match up with the $750,000 budget. Additionally, once the grants are awarded under this program, we will be utilizing the process outlined in the nationwide programmatic agreement to meet our responsibilities under Section 106. So this is a bit different from our previous disaster grant programs where we kind of had to start the programmatic agreement process from scratch at the start of each program. The nationwide PA is already in place and will be ready for use as soon as the grants are awarded. Training on the programmatic agreement and the allowances that are outlined in the programmatic agreement are forthcoming, but in the meantime, I just wanted to touch on a couple of higher level points as they apply to these disaster grants going forward. So, state historic preservation offices and THPOs as applicable will generally be responsible for Section 106 review for activities under the capacity NOFO and any projects for which they are the applicant under the preservation NOFO. In both of these cases, the SHPO and THPO as applicable would be considered the authorized recipient under the nationwide PA to conduct the Section 106 review. If you are a THPO that is not currently a tribal signatory to the PA, but you are interested in becoming one to do the Section 106 review for resources that are on the tribe's lands, that process is outlined in the PA, but feel free to send us any questions and give us a call if you have if that is something that you're interested in doing. Most of the undertakings under the capacity NOFO will likely not require further Section 106 review or will fall under a programmatic allowance as are outlined in Appendix B and Appendix C of the nationwide PA. But again, the specifics of those appendices will be discussed in a training further down the line. MPS will be responsible for Section 106 review for other grantee organizations that apply under the preservation NOFO and where those grantee organizations are not authorized recipients under the nationwide PA. So essentially under the preservation NOFO, if you are a SHPO that applies under the preservation NOFO, you will likely be an authorized recipient. You will typically be the authorized recipient conducting the Section 106 review for your projects. If a nonprofit applies to carry out projects in your state, MPS would be the ones responsible for conducting that Section 106 review. But hopefully that will kind of reduce the review burden a bit for SHPO staff and kind of balance out the workload on all sides. MPS will also continue to be the lead for tribal consultation and will continue NEPA review responsibilities. Okay. Next steps. So as we already discussed, the deadline for the capacity grants is June 12th in grants.gov, and the deadline for the preservation grants is July 15th in grants.gov. So the capacity grants are open for 30 days, and the application for the preservation grant is open for 60 days. In terms of award announcement, we're generally anticipating summer for the capacity grants and early fall for the preservation grants. It's always subject to change, but that is our goal. And in the case of awards under both of these grants, it'll start with a 3-year performance period. Just to wrap up here, I wanted to go over a few frequently asked questions. I've touched on a lot of this information throughout the presentation, so feel free to stop here, but I did want to touch on some of these points in a little bit more detail before we sign off here. Again, the program will not be funding subgrants, which is very different from our previous disaster programs. Again, applicants are encouraged to apply for multiple projects under one application, and the projects and sites should be defined at the time of submission, but instead of managing those multiple projects as subgrants, you should plan to manage those projects either in-house or through contracts or consultants. And a reminder that you can charge those personnel and staffing costs to the budget in your application. Are private individuals eligible to apply? So again, in our previous programs, some states allowed private individuals to apply for subgrants. In the case of these new grant programs, private individuals may not apply directly. However, eligible applicants can apply on behalf of those owners. You should be including a letter of owner consent that provides written permission for the applicant to be completing that project and for any applicable easements as part of your application, but you can apply on behalf of those owners. An example I might provide is, you might be a SHPO that applies on behalf of multiple property owners across a historic district. And in that case, you could carry out the project work either in-house, or you might consider procuring one contractor or one or two contractors that are going to carry out repairs for that whole group of buildings, and you'll just manage those one or two contracts. Another question that we have heard is, well, what if a SHPO or THPO applies for costs under one NOFO, say applies for staffing costs under the capacity NOFO to manage projects under the preservation NOFO, or vice versa, but you're not awarded both grants? If that were to happen, please be assured that we will work with the SHPO or THPO to adjust the budget accordingly. In terms of how much funding will be available for each NOFO and how that money will be split, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but again, applicants are encouraged to apply for the funding that you need. And funds will be awarded to the SHPOs and THPOs under the first NOFO for capacity, and then the remaining funds will be awarded on a competitive basis to the eligible entities under the second NOFO for preservation, which is part of the reason why we're trying to work on a shorter schedule for the capacity NOFOs and get that funding out to you all a little bit sooner. Again, if you are a SHPO or THPO looking to do survey work, you should apply for those activities under the capacity NOFO. As far as eligible survey under the preservation NOFO, that would be limited to, say, something like archaeological investigations that might be necessary prior to some physical preservation. Again, survey that's related to anything that might be required for pre-preservation work, but surveys that are just seeking to identify sites, you should apply for that work under the capacity NOFO, not the preservation NOFO. Additionally, do specific preservation projects need to be identified at the time of application? Again, the application should outline all of the defined projects and should include the owner consent for those projects if the applicant is not the owner of those properties. If you apply to repair multiple sites and an issue were to occur down the line with one of those sites that you intended to work on, for example, insurance ended up paying for more than you anticipated, we can certainly discuss alternatives on a case-by-case basis, but the goal is to have a clear scope at the start of the grant so that we can get the funds and the construction started as quickly as possible for you guys. Related to the previous question, should you submit separate applications for separate projects? The short answer is no. You should be submitting one application under each of the Notice of Funding opportunities for all of the planned projects that you intend to carry out. So for example, if you're going to manage a contract for physical repairs across multiple buildings across the state, you'd submit one application under the preservation NOFO and then describe each of the intended project sites in that single application. Overall, this means that as SHPOs and THPOs that are looking for both capacity funding and funding for physical repairs, at a maximum, you would be submitting up to 2 applications, one for each notice of funding opportunity. So 1 application for all of the capacity related activities and 1 application for all of the preservation and physical repair activities. And I will finish it up there, posting our contact information, although I'm sure many of you already have it. But again, if you have any questions or you want to run any project ideas by us or brainstorm a bit, please reach out to us, and we're happy to chat in more detail regarding specific questions. Thank you.